I wanted to start by thanking Luiz DeConzo, Sarah Macia, and Karen Metheny for inviting me to participate in this session. I'm also very disappointed not to be there in person with you all in Philadelphia, but I had a COVID exposure a few days ago and didn't want to take the risk of accidentally sharing with you all. I feel like that would have made Mary very mad. So the title of this paper may make you think that I misunderstood the assignment, but so much of how I think about 19th century prostitution in terms of labor really comes down to my former advisor, Mary Beaudry, and how she interrogated my ideas as I was working through the dissertation process with her. When I began at BU as a graduate student almost a dozen years ago, I'd recently finished a senior thesis looking at the archaeological evidence of children in brothels, specifically the children of madams and sex workers. I was pretty sure that I wanted to continue expanding on this, and Mary offered me the use of the 2729 Endicott Street collection that had come under her stewardship shortly before I began graduate school. So as an aside, after I completed my degree, the collection was transferred to the Boston City Archaeology Lab, where Joe Bagley and his team have done incredible work digitizing the collection and making it fully accessible to the public. If you haven't visited the City Lab's website, you really should. The URL is down below, but you can also Google Boston City Archaeology Laboratory, Endicott Street, and it should come up. This collection derived from the 1993 excavation carried out as mitigation for the Big Dig project, which placed Boston's central artery underground. Archaeologists excavated the remains of a double-chambered brick-lined privy associated with the 2729 Endicott Street lot in Boston's North End neighborhood. Dating to the middle of the 19th century, it was later discovered that the materials in the privy primarily correlated to the period between 1853 and 1867, when the building at 2729 Endicott Street housed a brothel run by 3 subsequent madams. All told, there were over 8,000 artifacts that came out of the privy, and it was a remarkably rich and compelling collection to work with. Although graduate work on the privy assemblage had been done, ironically, Mary was the first person to publish on the collection as a brothel assemblage specifically, posing questions that we explored together during the course of my dissertation work. At the time, there was a single piece of evidence that had been found that tied the site to sex work in the form of the 1866 Boston tax valuations, which listed Mary Lake with the occupation prostitution. I would later discover that Mary Lake was the 3rd subsequent madam of the 2729 Endicott Street brothel and only held that position for 2 years before marrying William Paddleford, who claimed to be a doctor, surgeon, and physician, but seems to have been trained as a plasterer. Mary also gave me the first opportunity that I had for publication. She invited me to be a co-author with her in an edited volume that she was compiling with her colleagues James Nyman and Kevin Fogel on intimate economies. For those of you who knew Mary, however, you know she always had at least 10 research irons in the fire. And after a few months of pulling further and further back from her contributions to our chapter, she finally said, I think you should just solo author this. It was the first time, though, I'd really considered clandestine and intimate networks as their own class of exchange and how their qualities would inform the archaeological record. In places like Boston, where prostitution at best enjoyed brief periods where the city looked the other way but was never legalized, its criminalization affected how the practice was carried out. As Barbara Meal Hobson notes in her book on the history of Boston prostitution, you can observe changes to the quality of how and where prostitution is carried out with different approaches to moral reform. For example, right around when moral reform was becoming legislated in the city government in the 1830s, there was a steady rise in the number of brothels in Boston. Before this, most sex work was carried out by independent actors in taverns or houses of assignation. Having a bureaucratic buffer in the form of a madam in between the sex worker and the state might have meant a serious reduction in profits by the individual sex worker and a host of added opportunities for violence or discomfort. At the same time, however, joining a brothel may have provided protection from arrest and oversight in the interactions between sex workers and troublesome or dangerous customers. On Mary's encouragement, I leaned into the idea of intimacy, expanding on the sexual intimacy that immediately springs to mind when considering sex work, namely the intimacy that sex worker would have with their own body that informed the intimacy of the acts they shared with their customer, their self-commodification, as well as the intimate sensual fantasy of the brothel environment created for the success of the brothel business. At the same time, in this analysis, I failed to truly emphasize the realities of labor performed in brothel sites, performed clandestinely, but within the constraints of legal oversight and the performative space of the brothel. For many in the 19th century, the decision to enter sex work may have not merely been a means of earning a wage, something that could have been done by many women in the industrialized areas of 19th century New England, but may also have been a form of resistance by young female factory workers. In Massachusetts, women in factory work in 1850 only earned between $3 and $3.50 a week. Simultaneously, prostitutes in elite brothels could charge as much as $5 per customer. There were multiple ways that increased income could benefit the individuals who took part. Ignoring basic financial motivations by reducing these individuals to caricatures of lustful fallen women or focusing on desires for luxury or fancy dress, as contemporary reform authors did, it sells the history of 19th century sex work short. Besides, there's little evidence that the sex workers at 2729 Endicott Street were spending their money on luxuries and dress or adornment. When Mary wrote about the 2729 Endicott Street brothel initially, she chose to do so through the lens of archaeological biographies, emphasizing the importance of people over patterns at sites. I don't know if Mary actually hated analyses that had tried to establish site patterns, but I do know that she scrawled "do not say patterns" in large block letters across an early draft of my proposal, when it suggested I might contribute to the search for a brothel assemblage pattern. On the contrary, it was incredibly gratifying to bring Mary my newest discoveries about the people who'd occupied 2729 Endicott Street and speak at length with her about what their lives might have been like. For a time, I became fixated on trying to create my own fragmented biographies of the individuals who loomed large in my site research. 2729 Endicott Street Madam Louisa Cohen came from an area of Vermont that is still incredibly rural and remote, even today only boasting a population of around 1,200, where her family kept a farm. Her successor, Mary Lake Paddleford, also came from a farming family in a part of Maine that achieved its largest population in 1850 with just over 1,300 residents, and might have left in order to support an illegitimate child. Doubtless, these women did not see many opportunities for themselves in their hometowns. Many female sex workers in Boston were likely made up of the hundreds of women flooding into the cities from the surrounding farmlands to take advantage of the opportunities urban centers afforded to earn a wage and gain independence. As I've already noted, however, the legal opportunities available may not have been as lucrative as they seemed from the outset. I first read Living on the Boot on the long plane ride from Portland, Oregon to visit with Mary for the first time after accepting my admission to Boston University. It was not until much later that I realized how much that book, which Mary wrote with Steve Mrozowski and Grace Seesing in 1996, had informed the way I thought about the brothel at 2729 Endicott Street. On the one hand, Mary's research into mills and boarding houses provided me with a much more secure understanding of what the life of a female mill worker might have been like. On the other hand, the collective space of multiple women living communally, of course, drew parallels. But I also had several conversations with Mary about where I saw further similarities of living in a space that was ultimately controlled by your employer. Mary pushed me to consider the space as even more deeply informed by the business of the brothel, as my earlier comparison was too surface level. A better correlation could have been if the female workers at the boot mills were sleeping in the factory next to the machinery. As I've discussed elsewhere, everything about the brothel prioritized the business, and its use as a residence was entirely secondary, or at best incidental. While I like Margaret Kennedy's term corporate households, or places in which people were living and working under a manager to describe brothels, it can be further argued that urban brothels in many ways resembled corporate structures, though on a smaller scale and with largely transitory and psychological products instead of material goods. Each house of prostitution was attempting to attract particular classes of clientele, essentially operating within a sort of sex work free market and remaining finely attuned to the needs and desires of their customers. The money generated by the global industrial economy in 19th century America aided the development of a clear ranking of brothel spaces and allowed them to be lucrative, despite efforts to eradicate sex work in Boston and other cities. Where before, a customer seeking sex for hire, who wasn't very wealthy, might have needed to rub elbows with more undesirable elements, or risk being duped by a con artist and robbed. Under the flourishing brothel system, middle-class houses boasted a club-like atmosphere, with assurances of safety and anonymity. After all, if those things could not be assured, then the brothel would not fare well in this clandestine market, and those customers would simply seek their entertainment at an establishment that could. The brothel at 2729 Endicott Street seemed to do well in this market. In the second year that Louisa Cohen was the madam, she made enough money to buy her family's farm and rent it back to her parents for $1 a year. On her death, she made considerable bequests, both in cash and also high-cost goods to her family members. As Mary Lake was the only non-family member to receive a bequest, Louisa may have also passed on the running of a lucrative and highly successful brothel to her former worker as well. Sex work can be comprised of physical, emotional, and psychological labor to some degree. Additionally, sex workers, like all laborers in a capitalist system, take part in the broader marketplace and receive goods or money for the services that they provide. Despite this, the position of the labor of sex work within the broader market has been understudied. Largely seen as marginal and clandestine by the general populace, it's important to consider what this labor meant to the sex worker performing it, the people directly benefiting from that labor, and the community at large. Even in the 19th century, prostitution was still just a job, and as Christian Gensmer asks, was it any more degrading than the more traditional employment available to women, such as service or factory work? As established, it was considerably better paid. It is probable that brothel life for the women working in prostitution was close-knit, tedious, and broken occasionally by excitement. Undoubtedly, the reason that archaeologists have such difficulty identifying sites of prostitution through the material culture alone has to do with its reality of the quiet repetition of brothel practices. Although the women within the house had agency within their own lives, evidence suggests that everything about the daily brothel space, from the table settings to the personal health and grooming of the women employed at 2729 Endicott, was carefully constructed with the explicit purpose of the brothel's economic success. For that reason, the clandestine economies of houses of prostitution are less related to the individual actions of the women working there, but rather the corporate unit of the space as a whole. This is not to diminish the agency of the individual actors employed there, however, and personal items such as a recovered piece of hair jewelry down to individualistic and decorative toothbrushes recovered from the privy speak to attempts to carve out one's own intimate identity. That being said, there is value in assessing brothel assemblages as a whole unit and discovering the evidence of individual lives within it. As Mary noted in her concluding remarks in Stories That Matter, unfolding the biographies of individuals through archaeology forces us to, quote, consider the many ways in which people took advantage of the possibilities and opportunities of the urban environment to negotiate their identities, to survive, and to prosper. Madams used the significant capital that they accumulated managing the commodification of the individuals below them to not only add to their own personal wealth, but many also returned that capital to their communities or their own families in various ways, like Louisa Cohen's numerous valuable bequests in her 1865 will. Mary always encouraged me to think bigger than just the objects, and to consider the real people that I was studying and the full lives that they lived outside their broken objects in the ground. I feel like her intellectual fingerprints are all over my research into the brothel at 2729 Endicott Street, and I hope that as I continue reassessing the research that she encouraged me in, I can keep intellectually expanding the world within which these people existed. Thank you, and stay safe, everyone.